Okay, we want to talk now about the lung lobule, which is the basic structure of the lungs. Okay, and it is the smallest subdivision of the lung that can be seen with the naked eye. It appears as a hexagon structure. Okay? I mean, hexagons, lots of them you can see here. We can see them here also. Well, these are the alveolar sacs, the alveoli. This is a good picture of the lung lobule, okay? So you can see here they're hexagon structures, and they can be seen on the surface. They're about the size of a pencil eraser, okay? So the lobule is a segment of the lung tissue. It is bound by connective tissue. It's called a stroma, but it is really a elastic connective tissue. You can see here, and the lobule will receive one arteriole and one venual leaves. And there's also a capillary network. We can see that better over in this picture here. So there's going to be one arteriole, okay, and that enters, and one venule that leaves each lobule, and then there's a capillary network as well. The lobule also receives, we can see here, one terminal bronchiole, okay, several respiratory bronchioles. You can see here 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 respiratory bronchioles, and of course, several ducts, several sacs, and several alveoli. Okay, now the circulation is important to understand because we have a pulmonary artery. Okay, we have a pulmonary artery that is going to come from the right ventricle. Okay, and we know that the right ventricle is bringing in deoxygenated blood from the systemic circulation, and then that artery becomes an arteriole, which we can see here, okay? And the arteriole then will become, as we follow it down into the actual sac structure, which we call the alveolar sacs, we see the capillary networks, okay? And the capillary network is beneath the alveolar epithelium. And then there's going to be one venule, okay, one venule. Where is that labeled here? Capillary, let's see, the pulmonary venule, okay, we see that is going to be leaving the lung lobule, and the venule will become a pulmonary vein, okay, eventually. This becomes a pulmonary vein, and we're going to finally arrive, this pulmonary vein will go to the left atrium, okay, after it goes to the lung, after the blood goes to the lungs to be reoxygenated, it goes to the left atrium, then the left ventricle, and then to the systemic circulation. Note that any small clot of a pulmonary artery branch will stop blood flow to a group of alveoli or lobules. And this is called the pulmonary embolism. Okay, so now we're going to move on to something else. We're going to move to the respiratory membrane. If I can get my iPad working. I just want to point out to you that pneumonia, this is just a side thing, but pneumonia is an infection of the lobules of the lung. And in pneumonia, the respiratory function deteriorates as a result of fluid leaking into the alveoli or swelling of the respiratory bronchioles. And when bacteria are involved, usually species normally found in the mouth and the pharynx that have somehow invaded the respiratory defenses are going to cause a pneumonia. Pneumonia becomes likely when the respiratory defenses have been compromised by other factors, such as epithelial damage from smoking or the breakdown of the immune system that we used to see in AIDS patients. It was very common in AIDS patients many years ago to see infections by the fungus Pneumocystis carinii. Okay? These organisms normally are found in the alveoli, but in healthy individuals, normal respiratory defenses are able to prevent their infection and any kind of tissue damage that they could cause. Okay, we want to look at the respiratory membrane, which is very important because the respiratory membrane is going to be where the gas exchange occurs. Okay, this is the respiratory membrane, okay, right across here, all right? So the respiratory membrane, of course, is for gas exchange, and the alveolar exchange surface is about 140 square meters. That's about the size of a tennis court, okay? That's about the size of a tennis court. Now, the respiratory membrane components, well, let's take a look here. We have the capillary lumen, okay? Capillary lumen. We see here some red blood cells, okay? Then we have the capillary endothelium, okay? Next is the capillary endothelium. And the capillary endothelium lines the capillaries adjacent to the alveolus. And the basement membrane of these endothelial cells and the basement membrane of the alveolar epithelium, which is on the other side, we can see over here, the epithelial membranes of the alveolus is on this side, but the basement membranes of these adjacent structures are going to fuse. In other words, the basement membrane of the capillary endothelium and the basement membrane of the alveolar epithelium, these basement membranes will fuse, okay? And they form the surface we see right here in blue, okay? This is the surface in blue here. So here you see the capillary basement membrane. Here we see the epithelial basement membrane of the alveolus, okay? And they fuse at this point right in here, okay? Now, what else do we have here? Well, on the inside, then, we have the airspace, okay? So after we pass by the epithelium of the alveoli, or the alveolus, we have the airspace. So we can look at the big picture here, okay? So here we see the basement membrane. Here we see the, over here we see the capillary endothelium, and then here we see the alveolar epithelium. And then we have the airspace. Now, the alveolar epithelium is a thin, simple squamous epithelium. So we have squamous cells here lining the alveolus. Okay, and there's different types. We're not going to get into them, but there's different types. But and the capillary endothelium lines the capillaries adjacent to the alveolus. Okay. Now, there's alveolar fluid, mostly water, okay, that lines the surface of the alveoli. And this creates a surface tension, which tends to collapse the alveoli. However, there is surfactant, which is an oil secretion. It's a coating over the alveolar epithelium to decrease the surface tension in the alveolus. And so it keeps the alveoli inflated between breaths. if there is not enough surfactant due to an injury, or it's a genetic condition, then each inhalation has to be forceful enough to pop open the alveoli, okay, besides an exchange of gases. And this is a great effort. This would require a great effort to inflate and deflate the lungs. You can't do this for very long, and you would enter into something called respiratory distress syndrome. Now, the respiratory membrane components we've just looked at, but I just want to say that this distance between the lumen of the capillary and the lumen of the airspace is only about 1.3 micrometers. That's the distance that separates the air and the blood. This is not considered a barrier to gas movement. So diffusion is going to be very rapid, not only because of the small distance, but also because oxygen and carbon dioxide are lipid soluble, so they can readily pass through this fused basement membrane area. There's also alveolar macrophages, or they're called dust cells, that patrol the alveolar epithelium and phagocytize any dust or debris on the alveolar surface, okay? So here we have, again, an example of a macrophage. It is specifically in the alveolus, so it's called a dust cell. Okay, so the lungs, then, the structure, we're going to talk about them next, now that we understand a little bit about the respiratory membrane. Here's another picture showing us a nice view of this, of the surfactant. Okay, here we see the capillary endothelium, the fused basement membranes, the alveolar epithelium, okay, the surfactant. We see these macrophages, okay, there's other types of cells here that produce the surfactant. Okay, I want to talk about the lung structure, and the structure of the lungs is pretty macroscopic. So together, the two of them weigh about 2.5 pounds. And they're soft, spongy, elastic organs. The left and right lung occupy the left and right pleural cavities respectively. Each lung is separated by fissures. Now, in the right lung, okay, in the right lung, there are 3 lobes. So we look at the right lung over here. We see 3 lobes, okay, a superior, a middle, and an inferior, okay? And in the left lung, we see a superior and an inferior lobe because we need space for the heart. So we don't have 3 lobes here because we need space for the heart. In fact, we notice here that there is a cardiac notch, okay? Now, the top part over here that goes slightly above the first rib and into the base of the neck is called the apex. So we have an apex here, and we have an apex over here. Okay, that's the apex of the lung. The concave base of each of these lungs, each lung has a concave base, and this sits on the diaphragm. The other surface, this surface here, is considered to be the costal surface. The anterior surface is called the costal surface because right overlying it are, of course, the ribs. The mediastinal surface is irregular on both sides, okay? So we have the mediastinal surface, it's kind of irregular. And the cardiac notch is over here on the left lung. It's an indentation, and it is going to be on the mediastinal surface, and it on the left lung, of course, and it conforms to the shape of the heart, okay? Now, the lungs are light and spongy. The lung volume is mostly air, okay? And it consists of air-filled passageways and alveoli, and it can accommodate large volume changes due to the elastic fibers that we saw around each lung lobule. The pleura, or this is a serous membrane. Here's a nice picture showing us where the lungs fit into the rib, behind the rib cage or within the rib cage. And here's the diaphragm over here. So the apex of the lung extends just above the first rib on both sides. This is showing us the pleura, okay? The visceral pleura is the pleura, the serous membrane that actually adheres to the lung surface, okay? And the parietal pleura is going to line the wall of the rib cage, okay? And we remember that these are connected. We can use a simple model of putting our finger into a balloon, and when we push our finger in the balloon, the part of the rubber that adheres to your fingers is the visceral, and then there's a space, and then the rest of the balloon rubber is the parietal pleura. It represents the parietal pleura. So you have the parietal and the visceral, and the pleural cavity is a potential space, in other words, a possible space for fluid. And there's a fluid here which lubricates the surfaces to reduce friction as the lungs are inflating and deflating. There's a diagnostic procedure called thoracentesis, which is when you take a long needle and you insert it between the ribs to extract pleural fluid to examine it for things like bacteria or cells or other materials that are not supposed to be there. Okay, so we want to get now into a little bit about respiratory physiology. And respiratory physiology involves 4 steps: breathing, which is ventilation. It also involves gas diffusion across the respiratory membrane, and then exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the interstitial fluids and tissues. And then we also have another step, which is the storage and transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. And we'll consider gas diffusion and gas exchange actually together. But the first thing we'll talk about is pulmonary ventilation, which is breathing, as soon as I get to the right PowerPoint, which I think I've opened already. Yep, that's this one here, pulmonary ventilation, okay. This will bring us to some chemistry and physics, which I know are your favorite subjects, but all right, now, pulmonary ventilation or breathing is the physical movement of air in and out of the tracts in the lungs. And the respiratory cycle is one breath. It is one inspiration and it is one expiration. Now, pressure and airflow. Air flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, okay? We all know this rule. Air flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Now, we want to look at the mechanics of breathing. And the mechanics of breathing, or pulmonary ventilation, is due to continuous pressure gradients. We have to recall that the anatomy of the lungs, there's a lot of elastic tissue, okay? And the lungs are contained in an airtight cavity, the thoracic cavity, and the bottom of the cavity, or the pavement, is the diaphragm. The mechanics of breathing is explained with Boyle's law. If you recall, pressure times volume is equal to a constant. Therefore, P and V are inversely proportional or inversely related. When pressure goes up, volume goes down. When volume goes down, pressure goes up, and so forth. On inspiration, that is when we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and it flattens, okay? It moves down. Thus, the rib cage expands. Therefore, the volume of the thoracic cavity has increased because the lungs, and as a result, the lungs expand, okay? The volume of thoracic cavity is larger now because the diaphragm has flattened down. It's no longer dome-shaped. The cavity is larger, the lungs expand. So, the volume in the lungs increases. Therefore, by Boyle's law, the pressure in the lungs decreases. Now the pressure in the lungs is lower than the pressure of the atmosphere. As a result, the pressure gradient is created, and since the pressure of the atmosphere is greater than the pressure in the lungs, air diffuses now into the lungs, So we bring oxygen to the blood-bathed alveoli. This continues until the pressure in the lungs equals the pressure of the atmosphere. On expiration, okay, when we breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes. That means it moves up. It becomes dome-shaped. So also, in addition to this, the lungs have a natural tendency to recoil due to the elastic tissue. But in any event, the volume of the thoracic cavity now decreases, okay? The lungs have become, the diaphragm rather, has become dome-shaped again. So the thoracic cavity has decreased. So the volume of the lungs has decreased. So as a result of Boyle's law, if the volume of the lungs decreases, what happens to the pressure in the lungs? It's going to increase. And as a result, air flows now out, since the pressure in the lungs now is greater than the pressure in the atmosphere. Okay, we're going to take a short break at this point.